I don't think the system works.
How would you have it work?
What an excellent question, and one which, coincidentally, I have put some light thought into of late. Allow me to briefly summarize a very high-level overview of how I believe the system should work.
Oh, Anakin, you know you can go as deep as you want to with me.
Duly noted! But perhaps we can go deeper another time. Regardless, the first question one must ask oneself is, what is the core of good governance? I propose there are 4 pillars, which our present system sorely lacks. The Twi'lek thinker Thom outlined that the first priority of government was to avoid the horrors of violence and war. It was, he argued, a dichotomy between the state of nature prior to setting up a government wherein one would live one's life sans any security, bar that which you yourself can bring with your own strength, and that of a common power, keeping the peace internally and protecting against foreign invasion.
I have a body part that'd be open to foreign invasion.
Ashobbes, advancing the work of Pla-Ato, outlines the notion of a contract, wherein individuals would give up some natural freedoms in exchange for a measure of security granted them by the state. The Hutt thinker Locka, writing after Thom, agreed with the latter's arguments, introducing tacit consent, whereby one is implicitly agreeing to the authority of the government by living within a state, even for a short time.
Okay, I think I get the gist. We can go do other things now.
It is important to note this description of government has been heavily critiqued by the Rhodian thinker Daaved Hu'Ume. He points out that the original establishment of states was formed by violence and submitted to only by necessity. He goes further, noting that the notion of tacit consent only makes sense against a background of free choice.
I think we should retire to my rooms.
Why? We're both so young. I plan to work until I die.
No,
Returning to
Anakin,
our
that's
prior
not what I meant.
conversation, does a poor artisan deep within Alderaan have the ability to simply leave the Republic? With what credits could they do so? Hu'Ume's point was that we do not need contract theory to ground our obligation to respect the state's authority. It is common sense society would collapse without such respect. Of course, this was but an interesting side tangent. The minutiae of contract theory are very intriguing, and we can perhaps engage with it another time. However, the core point I was attempting to communicate was that government is intended to keep the peace. Yet, what do we see in the Republic? The rumblings of a civil war, fermented by planets attempting to freely leave the Republic, which, as an addendum to our previous interesting side tangent, contract theory suggests they should be able to do, yet they struggle. Alas, I fear peace is not something this present system offers us, despite it being a core pillar of a good government.
You're not picking up what I'm putting down.
Why? Have you dropped something?
Only a few dozen hints.
Next, we must turn our attention to another core aspect of what I believe is crucial for any government to offer its citizens: freedom. Now, we must be precise in what we mean by freedom, after all. As argued by Ashobbes, total freedom. Without government means a freedom to die, perhaps through exposure to the elements, perhaps at the claws of a wampa.
You say it almost like those would be threats you'd face back to back.
Haha, could you imagine?
Vividly. I like to imagine it'd be on the ice planet Hoth. Perhaps I'd be rebelling against a cruel and oppressive empire.
No one's ever engaged with my hypothetical before. Anyway, philosophy. Consider, therefore, the notion argued by the Wookiee philosopher Isaibelin. There are 2 basic types of freedom, negative and positive. Negative freedom is, fundamentally, the freedom from interference. For example, I have a right to tell anyone and everyone about how sand is coarse and rough and irritating, and that it gets everywhere, without Master Eathcoth beating me up and stealing my lunch money.
Does that happen often?
Anyway, philosophy. It's worth noting that not all restrictions on one's possible choices are infringements on negative freedoms. If one wished to do something unnatural, like shooting lightning from their fingies...
Why do you call fingers fingies?
That's just because that's what my mother called them when I was younger, so I've kept up the habit. In a way, it feels like keeping a small piece of her with me. Especially because when I asked if we could free her from the slavery we left her in, I was told no. Well, actually, Yoda looked me up and down, said slavery was a skill issue, then walked off. But I took it as a no.
We should go save her. Or check in on her, at least.
Well, I'm sure she's fine. Besides, Jedi aren't supposed to have attachments.
No attachments? But what about love?
I asked Yoda about love once. He just told me that women only want alimony and child support, then said MGTOW for life and threw a sofa at me. Anyway, one's inability to do the unnatural of shooting lightning from their fingies doesn't mean their freedom is being impinged.
You say it's unnatural, but what about Master Plo Koon's electric judgment?
That's just a legend.
How can you have a legend about someone who isn't dead? Couldn't we just ask him?
Positive freedom is the freedom to do something rather than the freedom from interference. Returning to our example of Naboo, just because the Republic does not forbid one from leaving the planet, that does not mean one can. After all, one may not have the credits to do so.
Or one may be blockaded by the Trade Federation.
We've arrived at another core failing of the Republic. Consider the invasion of Naboo. The Trade Federation blockaded the planet, and if they had their way, we would still be restrained, while the Trade Federation inflicted atrocities. The Republic fails to secure freedoms for its citizens, both positive and negative. Those on Naboo were not free from the harm inflicted by the blockade, nor were they enabled to live their best lives.
Are you living your best life, Anakin?
I'm not sure. Last week, Master Obi-Wan told me.
Force above, Anakin! How many times have I told you not to turn your back on me while I'm talking to you? It makes me so mad I could just hurl myself out of the window!
He survived, but it gives one pause for thought. What if Jedi keep jumping out of windows around me? Whatever, I'll burn that bridge when I come to it. We must, therefore, add another pillar to our understanding of good governance. An appropriate balance of positive and negative freedoms. Or more simply, and thus more fittingly, with our other identified pillar, freedom.
Interesting. Please, continue.
You actually like listening to me?
Of course. I was a bit distracted at first, but I think you're as engaging as you are handsome.
I'm sorry. The Jedi never taught me how to respond to positive feedback. Well, one time Master Windu gave me a compliment when he told me he was glad to finally see my lily-white ass. But I later learned that was sarcasm. Next, let us consider the flaws of democracy, identified by the Bith thinker Pla-Ato. He claimed in Book 6 of his work, Republic, that democracy is inferior to other forms of government, broadly on the grounds that democracy is necessarily hostile to the expertise required to appropriately govern societies. He highlights that the structure of democracies result in those who are expert in winning elections and nothing else are those who will come to dominate the democratic scene. After all, democracy emphasizes this expertise at the expense of expertise in solid governance. Ultimately, Pla-Ato argues, the state will become victim to poorly thought-out ideas that demagogues use to help themselves win office, and the state will end up floundering.
You highlight Pla-Ato's criticism of elected leaders, but what about Supreme Chancellor Palpatine? He's been very proficient. And he was elected fairly.
I'm sure even Pla-Ato would agree he is a rare exception. Sure, Palpatine collects Sith artifacts, wears Sith robes, and is always cackling to himself when he thinks no one is looking, but he's got a wonderful sense of humor, and the only thing he loves more than the arts is the Republic. However, Palpatine is but one man. He could easily end up falling down a seemingly bottomless pit or struck by lightning. And what then? Back to the array of demagogues? One is forced to ask oneself, is this just? Is it right that the proverbial ship of state will be thrown and tossed as endless waves of captains whose only qualification is that they are good at winning the office of captain, play at steering the ship, all the while it heads for the rocks? The answer, Pla-Ato argues, and it's one I'm inclined to agree with, is no. This is not just. It is both outrageous and unfair that countless innocent beings should be forced to suffer the ineffectual so-called leadership of such inept beings. Consider the former Supreme Chancellor Valorum, who was unable to act with any effectiveness on the blockade infringing Naboo's freedoms. A truly just society would be one where the ruler most suited to rule well is in charge. Therefore, another necessary pillar of state has been identified, that of justice.
But you're not actually against democracy, right? Just against demagogues seizing power.
Sure. Finally, we should consider the thoughts of the Chiss polymath, Mitth'raw'nuruodo. In his writings, he will highlight he hasn't written it yet. Anyway, he will highlight that a galaxy unified under a singular leader and with a militaristic focus would be better able to defend against and respond faster to Outside threats such as, hypothetically, an enemy living in the unknown regions of the galaxy seeking to enslave new clients to serve under their hegemon, then the Republic. As the man himself will put it, multiple species with multiple viewpoints and racial philosophies simply cannot hold power together for long. The dominant voice must certainly be wise enough to adopt ideas and methods from its allies and member peoples. But there must be a dominant voice, or there is only chaos. Ultimately, that requires a centralized regime, or put simply, there is a lack of security. To summarize, in its existing political form, the Republic cannot offer peace, freedom, justice, and security. I like to call these the Skywalker Core 4, representing the pillars of good governance. Therefore, in my humble view, any reasonable political system should ensure it offers these core 4 elements as a baseline. That is one which would get my full support.
Interesting. Well, I certainly understand at least a high-level overview of where you're coming from. That being said, I felt your description of freedoms, positive and negative, glossed over some of the nuances and could have done with some expansion. Although, I'm more aligned with the Trandoshan thinker Shue'nery'he, who argued all rights require both positive duties, such as protective or reparative actions, and negative duties, such as avoidant actions. So, I find the distinction somewhat redundant. Though, as I said before, I'd be happy to go deeper with you.
I believe you said something about retiring to your bedroom.